He fired her for being poor, but years later, she became his biggest competitor. Elena Carter hurried through the grand glass doors of King Enterprises, her heart pounding in her chest. The sleek, towering building made her feel small, a reminder of how little she belonged in a world filled with wealth and power. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floor as she rushed to her desk, barely making it on time. She couldn't afford to be late. Not today. Not ever. Her paycheck barely covered rent, her sick mother's medication, and her younger brother's school expenses. There was no room for mistakes. She kept her head down, working tirelessly, sorting through paperwork, scheduling meetings, and fetching coffee for people who barely noticed her existence. The fashion world was ruthless, and Alexander King was its undisputed ruler. He built his empire on perfection and had no tolerance for weakness. He was sharp, demanding, and merciless. Every time he entered the office, the air thickened with tension. His employees feared him, and for good reason. One mistake and you were gone. Elena knew that. She had seen it happen countless times, but she had never imagined she would be next. It was a simple mistake, a minor mix-up in an important client's schedule. But in Alexander King's world, minor didn't exist. He stormed out of his office, his cold blue eyes narrowing as he scanned the floor. The entire office fell silent. Everyone knew what was coming. "Elena Carter," he called, his voice slicing through the air like a knife. Her blood turned to ice. She stood slowly, feeling every pair of eyes on her as she approached his towering figure. He held up a printed email, the errors circled in red ink like a glaring wound. "Care to explain why my biggest client was left waiting for 30 minutes? His voice was calm, too calm. It was the kind of calm that came before a storm. I made a mistake," she stammered, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean. Mistakes cost money, Miss Carter," he cut her off sharply. "And in my company, I don't tolerate incompetence." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of him. She swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to stand tall, even as humiliation wrapped around her like chains. "You're fired." The words hit her harder than she expected. The room seemed to spin. She wanted to beg, to plead. She needed this job, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Alexander King had already moved on, turning his back to her as if she were nothing more than an afterthought. Shame crawled up her spine as she gathered her belongings under the watchful eyes of her coworkers. Some looked at her with pity, others with relief that it wasn't them. She walked out of the office with her head high, but inside, she was crumbling. She had nothing. No backup plan, no savings, nothing but the crushing weight of failure. As she stepped onto the street, cold air biting her skin, she made a silent vow. He had dismissed her like she was nothing. But one day, she would prove him wrong. One day, Alexander King would regret underestimating her. Elena's world collapsed in slow motion. After leaving King Enterprises, she sent out dozens of applications, clinging to hope. Days turned into weeks, each rejection letter chipping away at her confidence. At first, she thought it was just bad luck, but the pattern was undeniable. No one would hire her. No company even gave her a chance. And then, she heard the whispers. Alexander King. His name carried weight in the fashion world, and his influence stretched farther than she had realized. A single word from him could shut doors forever. It became clear he hadn't just fired her. He had erased her. Bills piled up. Her mother's medication ran low. Her brother's school fees loomed like an unavoidable storm. Elena had always been a fighter, but this felt impossible. Desperation drove her to odd jobs, sewing hems, patching up old designer pieces, sketching designs on scraps of paper. It was exhausting, but it was something. She worked through the nights, her fingers sore and her eyes burning, chasing a dream that felt so distant it might as well have been a mirage. One evening, while sitting in a quiet cafe, sketching out a dress idea on a napkin, she felt someone's gaze on her. Looking up, she met the sharp, knowing eyes of an older woman. Her sleek silver hair framed a face that once graced magazine covers. Madeline Pierce, a name Elena had read about in fashion history books. A woman who had built an empire only to disappear from the public eye years ago. That's an interesting design, Madeline said, tapping her red nails on the table. You have talent. Elena blinked, caught between disbelief and cautious hope. It's just an idea, she murmured, folding the napkin as if to hide it. Madeline raised an eyebrow. Ideas are the beginning of everything. Tell me, do you always hide your work? Something about her voice, strong yet understanding, made Elena's walls crumble. She hesitated, then slowly unfolded the napkin, revealing the delicate lines of a gown she had envisioned. Madeline studied it carefully. Raw but brilliant. She leaned back, assessing Elena in a way that felt unervingly precise. What's your name? Elena Carter. Recognition flickered in Madeline's eyes. Carter, she tapped her chin. King Enterprises? Elena stiffened but nodded. Not anymore. Madeline smirked. That man has ruined more careers than he's built. Her voice dripped with something close to amusement, but her gaze softened. Let me guess. He crushed you, and now you don't know how to put the pieces back together. Elena swallowed the lump in her throat. Something like that. Madeline's expression turned thoughtful before she pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. Meet me at this address tomorrow morning. If you're as good as I think you are, I might just have a place for you. Elena stared at the card, her pulse quickening. Was this real? A trick? But Madeline Pierce had no reason to play games. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, hope creeping in despite the fear whispering in the back of her mind. The next morning, Elena stood outside a grand, but slightly worn-down fashion studio. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. Madeline was waiting, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, her sharp eyes watching as Elena took in the space. Rolls of fabric lined the walls. Sewing machines hummed in the background, and the faint scent of fresh linen filled the air. Welcome to your second chance, Madeline said, handing Elena a sketch pad. Let's see what you can really do. Elena took it, her grip firm. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than despair. She felt possibility. Meanwhile, across the city, Alexander King sat in his pristine office, reviewing new designs, completely unaware that the woman he had dismissed as insignificant was about to become his greatest challenge yet. Elena threw herself into the work, determined to prove that Madeline's faith in her wasn't misplaced. Days blurred into nights as she sketched, cut, and stitched, learning to transform raw fabric into something extraordinary. Madeline was a strict mentor, but she never belittled Elena the way Alexander had. Instead, she pushed her, forcing her to refine every detail, to think beyond the ordinary. You have the talent, Madeline told her one evening, as they examined a half-finished dress. But talent alone isn't enough. In this world, you need grit. Elena absorbed every lesson, every criticism, until her fingers ached and her eyes burned. She experimented with bold designs, creating pieces that stood out, not just for their beauty, but for their story. She wanted her clothes to be more than fabric. She wanted them to mean something. Months passed, and slowly, her efforts began to pay off. Madeline helped her launch a small collection under a new label, one with no ties to King Enterprises, no shadow of Alexander looming over it. It was a modest start, but the response was promising. Fashion bloggers took notice. Small boutiques started calling. Her designs carried a fresh energy, something raw yet elegant, something different from the polished perfection that Alexander's brand was known for. She should have felt satisfied, but she wanted more. The opportunity came when Madeline pulled her aside one afternoon, a knowing glint in her eye. There's an upcoming fashion event, a big one. You should showcase your work. Elena hesitated. Are we ready for that? Madeline's smirk was unmistakable. You tell me. So they did it. They worked tirelessly, pouring everything into the designs. On the night of the event, Elena stood backstage, her stomach twisting in knots. She peeked through the curtain, heart pounding as she saw the crowd. Buyers, journalists, influencers. The room buzzed with excitement, but Elena's focus zeroed in on one man, seated near the front. Alexander King. He looked as powerful as ever, dressed in his signature black suit, his expression unreadable as he glanced at his phone, barely paying attention. He wasn't here for her, of course. He didn't even know she was behind this collection. But he was about to. The show began, and one by one, Elena's designs took the runway. The moment the first model stepped out, whispers spread through the crowd. Her collection was unlike anything else being presented that night. Rich textures, daring cuts, and colors that told a story. Passion, struggle, resilience. Alexander lifted his gaze, his brow furrowing slightly. By the third outfit, he sat forward, his phone forgotten. The applause was deafening by the time the final piece hit the runway. A breathtaking gown, the embodiment of everything Elena had worked for. Cameras flashed, designers whispered, and fashion critics scribbled notes furiously. Alexander's jaw tensed. He recognized competition when he saw it, but he still didn't know whose work he had just witnessed. Not yet. Elena's brand was no longer just a whisper in the fashion world. It was a rising force. Orders flooded in, magazines featured her work, and influential stylists began requesting her pieces for high-profile clients. Every success fueled her hunger for more. She had spent years being overlooked, dismissed, and crushed under the weight of others' expectations. Now, she was no longer invisible. Her moment of triumph came at an elite gala, a gathering of the most powerful figures in the industry. Draped in one of her own creations, a sleek, midnight blue gown with intricate silver embroidery, she stepped into the grand ballroom, her chin high and her presence undeniable. She was no longer the timid assistant scurrying through King Enterprises. She was Elena Carter, a designer with a name that carried weight. The moment she saw him, she knew he had finally noticed her. Alexander King stood near the bar, holding a glass of whiskey, engaged in quiet conversation with an investor. But his sharp blue eyes locked onto her the second she walked in. For a moment, his expression remained unreadable, calculating, assessing. Then something shifted. Recognition, curiosity, annoyance. He excused himself from his conversation and made his way toward her, the crowd parting effortlessly in his path. When he stopped in front of her, the air between them tightened. "Elena Carter," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something unreadable. "I was starting to wonder why your name sounded familiar." She met his gaze, refusing to shrink under the weight of it. "Funny, I remember you saying I wasn't worth remembering." A flicker of something crossed his face, but it was gone in an instant. "You've certainly reinvented yourself. I'll admit, your work has caused some noise." "Not noise. Impact," she corrected, tilting her head. "Something you should understand. Or has your empire grown too comfortable?" A smirk played at his lips, but there was tension beneath it. "Confidence is one thing, Elena. Arrogance is another." She let out a soft laugh, the sound sharper than the champagne in her glass. Spoken like a man who doesn't like being challenged. The flicker of irritation in his eyes was subtle, but it was there. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, never breaking eye contact. "Business is a battlefield. You should know that by now. If you want to play in the big leagues, be prepared to lose." Elena stepped closer, her voice dropping just enough to make the moment intimate, cutting. "That's the thing, Alexander. You fired me because you thought I was weak. But you didn't break me. And now I'm not just playing. I'm winning." For the first time, something shifted in his gaze, something darker, deeper. A mix of intrigue and irritation. She had done more than get under his skin. She had unsettled him. He leaned in slightly, his tone deceptively casual. "We'll see about that." As he walked away, Elena knew one thing for certain. Alexander King was no longer indifferent to her. And that meant war was coming. The air was thick with tension. News had spread quickly. Elena Carter had secured the deal that Alexander King had spent months cultivating. A luxury department store, one of the most sought-after retail giants, had chosen her designs over his. It wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. At the industry gala that evening, the energy was palpable. The who's who of fashion mingled under the dazzling chandeliers, but all eyes flickered between two people, Elena and Alexander. She could feel his gaze from across the room, but she refused to acknowledge him first. Instead, She let the moment sink in, let the whispers fuel the shift in power. When he finally approached her, his presence was as commanding as ever. Dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, he held his drink with calculated ease, but his eyes were colder than usual. "Impressive," he said smoothly, though there was an undeniable edge to his tone. "I didn't think you had it in you." Elena turned to face him fully, her crimson gown brushing against the marble floor as she tilted her head. "You didn't think about me at all, remember?" She let the words hang between them, daring him to acknowledge the past. A flicker of something passed through his expression, annoyance, maybe something deeper. But he covered it quickly. "Business is business," he replied. "Enjoy your moment. It won't last." She let out a small, knowing smile. "That's where you're wrong, Alexander. I don't just plan to last. I plan to lead." Their words were a battle, their gazes locked in silent challenge. Yet, beneath the sharp exchanges, there was something else, an undercurrent neither of them wanted to name. Later that night, away from the flashing cameras and clinking glasses, Elena stepped onto the terrace for a breath of fresh air. The city lights stretched endlessly before her, a reminder of how far she had come. She thought she was alone until she heard footsteps behind her. "You don't celebrate?" Alexander's voice was quieter now, stripped of its usual arrogance. Elena sighed, resting her hands on the cool railing. "I don't have time to." A pause. Then, unexpectedly, he leaned against the railing beside her. "Neither do I." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fight, the competition, the past. Everything faded into the quiet hum of the city below. When she finally turned to look at him, she saw something she had never noticed before. The exhaustion behind his perfect exterior. The weight he carried. "You built your empire alone, didn't you?" she asked, her voice softer now. His jaw tensed, but he didn't look away. "And you?" Elena exhaled. "Alone at first, but I learned to let people in." A strange expression crossed his face, one of realization, maybe regret. He had spent so long seeing her as competition, as a challenge to overcome. But for the first time, he saw her as something else, as someone who had fought her way up just like he had. "You've changed," he said finally. She met his gaze, unflinching. "So have you." Neither of them knew what to do with that truth. Elena had fought too hard to let anything shake her now, but this betrayal cut deeper than she was prepared for. Her hands trembled as she stared at the documents on her desk, the proof of what she had feared. One of her closest business partners, someone she had trusted with the expansion of her brand, had taken money from Alexander's company. They had sold her out. Her breathing felt shallow as she sank into her chair, her mind racing through the implications. A major production deal she had worked for months to secure was now falling apart. Factories were backing out, suppliers were hesitating, and investors were withdrawing. It was a coordinated attack, and she knew exactly who was behind it. Alexander King. She should have expected it. He never lost. If he couldn't outrun competition, he destroyed it. Her phone buzzed, but she ignored it. Instead, she clenched her fists, staring at the betrayal laid out in front of her. Her chest ached, not just from anger, but from something deeper, disappointment. She had built this from nothing, pouring her soul into every design, every decision. And now, someone she had trusted had thrown it all away for a bribe. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't break. Not over this. Not over him. That evening, she sat in her mother's small apartment, staring out the window as rain trickled down the glass. Her mother, frail but sharp-eyed, watched her with quiet concern. "Talk to me, Elena," she finally said. Elena let out a breath, shaking her head. "I thought I was winning, Mom. I really did. But maybe I was just fooling myself. Maybe people like me don't get to win against men like Alexander King." Her mother's thin fingers covered hers, squeezing gently. "People like you?" she echoed. "Elena, listen to me. You didn't come this far because someone handed it to you. You fought. You bled for this dream. And if you think one man can take it all away, then you're not the daughter I raised." Elena swallowed the lump in her throat. "But I'm tired. It feels like no matter what I do, he's always 10 steps ahead." Her mother gave a small smile. Then take 11. A spark reignited in Elena's chest. She had spent years proving people wrong, clawing her way up from nothing. This wasn't the end. It couldn't be. Meanwhile, across the city, Alexander sat alone in his penthouse office, staring at the skyline. He had won. Elena's brand was faltering, and soon she'd have no choice but to step down. And yet, for some reason, victory didn't taste as sweet as it should have. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. Something about the way she had looked at him at the gala, the fire in her eyes, it had stuck with him. And now, knowing he'd been the one to snuff it out, left a bitter weight in his chest. Was this what success felt like? For the first time in his life, Alexander King wasn't sure. Elena pushed forward, refusing to let emotions cloud her path. The deal she had fought for, the one Alexander had nearly stolen from her, was now hers. Her brand was thriving, gaining momentum, and soon, her designs would be displayed in luxury boutiques across the country. The success she had dreamed of was finally within reach. But despite it all, something felt hollow. She barely had time to breathe, moving from one meeting to the next, ensuring every detail of her expansion was flawless. The industry was taking her seriously now. She was no longer just a woman Alexander King had fired. She was his competition. And yet, in the quiet moments, she couldn't shake the weight in her chest. Nights felt longer. She would sit by her window, staring out at the city lights, wondering why victory didn't feel as fulfilling as she had imagined. She had thought that proving herself, building something indestructible, would erase the hurt of the past. But instead, it lingered, a ghost she couldn't shake. Alexander's face haunted her in ways she hated to admit. She told herself she despised him, that she had every reason to. But then, there were those moments, the ones where she had seen something real in his eyes, something that made her question whether he was truly the ruthless man she had painted him to be. She shook the thought away. It didn't matter. She had won. That should be enough. Across the city, Alexander sat in his office, his mind drowning in thoughts he couldn't escape. He had built his empire from the ground up, crushing anything that stood in his way. He had spent years believing that power and success were all that mattered, that they were enough. But lately, nothing felt like enough. His company was still on top. His name still carried the weight of an industry giant. But the thrill of winning had faded. Ever since the night on the terrace, when Elena had stood beside him, showing him a side of himself he had long buried, something had shifted. He had sabotaged her, pushed her, done everything in his power to break her. And yet, she had risen. She had become stronger, and in some twisted way, he respected her more for it. But what did that mean for him? For the first time in his life, Alexander found himself questioning everything. He had spent so much time chasing after success, making sure no one could challenge him, that he had never stopped to ask himself what he truly wanted. The silence in his office was suffocating. He had built this world, yet he suddenly felt like a stranger in it. The only person who had ever made him feel something real was the one person he had tried to destroy. And now she was gone. Elena pushed forward, refusing to let emotions cloud her path. The deal she had fought for, the one Alexander had nearly stolen from her, was now hers. Her brand was thriving, gaining momentum, and soon, her designs would be displayed in luxury boutiques across the country. The success she had dreamed of was finally within reach. But despite it all, something felt hollow. She barely had time to breathe, moving from one meeting to the next, ensuring every detail of her expansion was flawless. The industry was taking her seriously now. She was no longer just a woman Alexander King had fired. She was his competition. And yet, in the quiet moments, she couldn't shake the weight in her chest. Nights felt longer. She would sit by her window, staring out at the city lights, wondering why victory didn't feel as fulfilling as she had imagined. She had thought that proving herself, building something indestructible, would erase the hurt of the past. But instead, it lingered, a ghost she couldn't shake. Alexander's face haunted her in ways she hated to admit. She told herself she despised him, that she had every reason to. But then, there were those moments, The ones where she had seen something real in his eyes, something that made her question whether he was truly the ruthless man she had painted him to be. She shook the thought away. It didn't matter. She had won. That should be enough. Across the city, Alexander sat in his office, his mind drowning in thoughts he couldn't escape. He had built his empire from the ground up, crushing anything that stood in his way. He had spent years believing that power and success were all that mattered, that they were enough. But lately, nothing felt like enough. His company was still on top. His name still carried the weight of an industry giant. But the thrill of winning had faded. Ever since the night on the terrace, when Elena had stood beside him, showing him a side of himself he had long buried, something had shifted. He had sabotaged her, pushed her, done everything in his power to break her. And yet, she had risen. She had become stronger, and in some twisted way, he respected her more for it. But what did that mean for him? For the first time in his life, Alexander found himself questioning everything. He had spent so much time chasing after success, making sure no one could challenge him, that he had never stopped to ask himself what he truly wanted. The silence in his office was suffocating. He had built this world, yet he suddenly felt like a stranger in it. The only person who had ever made him feel something real was the one person he had tried to destroy. And now she was gone. In the weeks that followed, Alexander made quiet but significant changes to his company. He restructured internal policies, ensuring ethical business practices that protected smaller designers instead of crushing them. He cut ties with corrupt partners, choosing integrity over dominance. These weren't moves to gain favor. They were actions he wished he had taken long ago. Then, in an industry-wide interview, he did the unthinkable. When asked about the rising competition, Alexander King openly acknowledged Elena Carter's talent. He didn't downplay her success or brush past her name. Instead, he admitted, on record, that her work was remarkable, that she had built something powerful on her own merit. Elena saw the interview replayed on her office television. She sat frozen as Alexander spoke words she never expected to hear from him. It wasn't just an empty compliment, it felt sincere. But after everything, could she trust it? Skepticism gripped her, but something deep inside her stirred. Maybe people could change. Maybe even Alexander King. The moment of truth came at the International Fashion Summit. The world's biggest names in the industry gathered in Paris, and Elena knew she would cross paths with him again. She prepared herself, strengthening the walls around her heart. And then, as expected, he was there. Dressed in his signature sharp suit, Alexander King stood across the Grand Hall, his eyes finding hers almost instantly. The weight of everything between them, past betrayals, unspoken truths, and something neither had dared to name, hung in the air. This time, it was Alexander who took a step forward. And for the first time, Elena didn't turn away. Elena stood in the Grand Hall, her heart pounding as Alexander approached. The weight of their history pressed between them, unspoken yet undeniable. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with uncertainty threading through her anger, never with a flicker of something softer beneath his usually cold gaze. Alexander exhaled slowly, as if steadying himself before he spoke. Elena, I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I need to say this. She crossed her arms, raising an eyebrow. You usually don't ask. You take. A shadow of a smirk touched his lips, but it faded just as quickly. I was wrong. About everything. About you. Elena felt the words settle into the air between them. Part of her wanted to throw them back at him, to remind him of every cruel thing he had done, every time he had underestimated her, tried to break her. But there was something raw in his expression, something unfamiliar. Regret. He glanced around at the bustling crowd of designers and executives before focusing back on her. Can we talk? Somewhere quieter. Against her better judgment, she nodded. Moments later, they stood on the terrace overlooking the Paris skyline. The cool night, air heavy with unspoken things. Alexander turned to her, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides, as if battling his own pride. I built my company on the idea that power meant control, he admitted. That success meant eliminating competition, crushing anyone who stood in my way. But then you happened, and for the first time, I saw what real strength looks like. Elena swallowed, her mind reeling. She had expected a fight, another round of strategic maneuvers. Not this. Not honesty. You didn't just prove me wrong, Elena. You became my biggest inspiration. He met her gaze, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his words. I don't want to fight you anymore. I want to work with you. Her breath hitched. You what? A collaboration. King Enterprises and Carter Designs. He let the words settle before continuing. Not as a power move. Not as a way to own any part of what you've built. But because I believe in what you're doing. Because I admire it. Because, he exhaled sharply, his voice lowering, because I admire you. Elena's chest tightened. She had spent years resenting him, turning every memory of him into fuel for her ambition. She had convinced herself that nothing he did could ever touch her again. But standing here, hearing him say the things she had once wished for, she felt something shift. She didn't know if she could trust him. Not fully. Not yet. But for the first time, she saw the man he was trying to become, not just the man he had been. I don't know if I can forgive you, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I do know that I've never backed down from a challenge. A flicker of something, relief, maybe even hope, crossed his face. Then let's build something incredible together. No tricks, no games, just the best of what we both have to offer. Elena hesitated for only a moment before extending her hand. Fine, but if you cross me again, Alexander, I'll bury you. A slow, genuine smile curved his lips. I wouldn't expect anything less. As their hands met, something shifted in the air between them. It wasn't just the beginning of a partnership. It was the beginning of something neither of them could name just yet. Elena turned the envelope over in her hands, her heart pounding. The weight of it felt heavier than paper and ink. It carried years of unspoken words, regrets, and something else she wasn't sure she was ready to name. Alexander had left it with no explanation, just a solemn look before walking away. She had almost thrown it away, almost let it sit unread. But now, in the quiet of her apartment, she hesitated. Taking a deep breath, she opened the letter. His handwriting was firm, deliberate, each stroke precise, much like the man himself. But the words inside weren't cold or calculated. They were raw, stripped of the armor he usually wore. Elena, I don't deserve your time, but I hope you'll give me these words. You once told me that I only know how to take. That power was all I understood. You were right, and I hate that you had to be the one to teach me that lesson. But you did, and I learned. Watching you build Carter Designs, seeing the world recognize what I was too blind to see, it should have been humbling. Instead, it was devastating, because I realized too late that I hadn't just underestimated you. I had underestimated what it means to create something with purpose, with passion. You didn't just succeed, Elena. You changed the industry, and you changed me. I know I've caused you pain. I can never undo that. But I want you to know that because of you, I'm trying to be better. Not for business, not for power. For myself. And maybe, someday for you. If you never want to see me again, I will understand. But if you do, if there's even the smallest chance, I'll be at the charity gala tomorrow night. Alexander. Elena closed her eyes, exhaling shakily. She had spent so long hating him, using that anger as fuel. But this was something different. Something she didn't know how to fight against. The next evening, she arrived at the gala, unsure of what she was looking for. The room was filled with the elite of the fashion world, but her eyes found Alexander instantly. He wasn't standing at the center, commanding attention. He was off to the side, speaking with a group of young designers, listening intently. The man who had once crushed competition without a second thought was now offering guidance, encouragement. She took a step forward, then another. He turned, as if sensing her before he even saw her. His expression shifted, hopeful, hesitant. Elena swallowed. Maybe she wasn't ready to forgive. Maybe she never would. But as she stood there, watching the man he was trying to become, she realized something else. Maybe she didn't have to hate him anymore either. The launch event buzzed with energy, the culmination of months of meticulous work, late-night brainstorming sessions, and an unspoken agreement that went far beyond business. Elena stood before the grand runway, her heart pounding as the first model stepped out in a creation that bore both her signature touch and the unmistakable refinement of King Enterprises' resources. It was a collaboration neither of them had ever imagined, yet now, under the bright lights, it felt inevitable. Alexander stood beside her, his usual composed demeanor tempered with something softer, pride, perhaps, or something even deeper. When he turned to her, his voice was low but earnest. "You did this." She met his gaze, a small smile playing at her lips. "We did this." The show unfolded flawlessly, each piece a testament to resilience, redemption, and reinvention. The audience, an elite mix of fashion critics, industry leaders, and global influencers, responded with captivated silence followed by thunderous applause. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered, and investors leaned in with newfound interest. It was everything Elena had dreamed of, and yet, the weight of this moment wasn't just in the success. It was in the journey that had led her here. As the final model took her bow, Alexander reached for her hand, hesitating just a fraction before letting it rest lightly over hers. "You were right to be cautious about me," he murmured. "I didn't deserve your trust before, but I meant what I said. This partnership, this success, it's yours. I just feel lucky to be part of it." Elena took a breath, feeling the truth in his words. The past had shaped them, but it didn't have to define them. She gave his hand a squeeze before stepping forward, meeting the press with her signature poise and confidence. Questions flew at her, each one laced with intrigue. "Elena, what made you decide to collaborate with King Enterprises after everything?" She glanced at Alexander before answering, her voice steady. "Because people can change. Because growth matters more than pride. And because at the end of the day, this industry is about creating something lasting, not just in fashion, but in who we choose to be." The response sent a ripple through the crowd, admiration flickering in the eyes of those who had once doubted her. Alexander, standing just behind her, exhaled slowly, as if absorbing the magnitude of what she had just given him. Acceptance, even if not yet love. Over the following months, their partnership flourished. The line became an instant success, sold-out collections, glowing reviews, and a growing empire that bore both their names. Elena remained fiercely independent, ensuring her brand stood strong on its own while embracing the opportunities their alliance provided. Alexander, for the first time, stepped back from controlling everything, letting the work speak for itself. Their relationship evolved in tandem with their business. At first, it was cautious, threaded with the remnants of past wounds. But over time, the walls between them cracked, revealing something more profound than rivalry, deeper than admiration. One evening, after a long day of overseeing production, Alexander found her on the balcony of her Paris studio, staring out over the city she had once only dreamed of conquering. "You never stop, do you?" he mused, stepping beside her. Elena smirked. "Neither do you." Silence settled between them, comfortable now. He studied her, as he had so many times before, but tonight there was no calculation, only admiration. "I don't think I've ever met anyone as strong as you," he admitted. "Not in business. Not in life." She turned to face him fully. "And I don't think I've ever met anyone who's proven me wrong as many times as you have." A slow smile curved his lips. "I'll take that as a compliment." She didn't respond right away, but the way she held his gaze, steady and unwavering, spoke louder than words. They weren't just business partners. They weren't just former enemies. They were something new, something neither of them had expected, but neither was willing to deny. As the city lights flickered below them, Elena made peace with the past. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and love didn't mean losing herself. She had won on her own terms. And perhaps, just perhaps, so had he. In the end, they were no longer fighting against each other. They were fighting for something greater. Together, Elena stood at the edge of her old neighborhood, the scent of freshly baked bread from the corner bakery mixing with the faint trace of exhaust from passing cars. The streets felt smaller than she remembered, Yet every detail was imprinted in her mind. The cracked pavement where she had once tripped and scraped her knees. The faded mural on the wall near the playground, colors now dulled by time. She had walked these streets as a girl, dreaming of the life she had now built with her own hands. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Alexander. "You did it." She smiled, shaking her head. "We did." Their collaboration had been more than a business venture. It had been a statement. A challenge to the industry that once thrived on exclusivity and cutthroat competition. Together, they had reshaped the narrative, proving that innovation and integrity could coexist. Carter King Designs had become a beacon for young designers, offering opportunities Elena once wished she had. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who had once tried to bury her now stood beside her, not as an adversary, but as an equal. Elena turned the corner and spotted a young girl sitting on the stoop of an old brick building, sketchbook balanced on her lap. Her brow furrowed in concentration, pencil moving furiously across the page. Elena's heart clenched at the familiarity of it. She knew that hunger, that quiet determination. It was the same fire that had burned in her own chest years ago. She approached slowly. "That's a beautiful design." The girl looked up, startled at first. Her eyes widened as recognition dawned. "You're Elena Carter." Elena crouched to the girl's level. "And you're an artist." The girl bit her lip, glancing down at her work. "I want to be. Someday." Elena studied the rough sketch. It was raw, unpolished, but filled with promise. "You already are." The girl's face lit up, a spark of confidence flickering in her eyes. The same spark that had once propelled Elena forward, that had refused to be dimmed by doubt or circumstance. Elena reached into her bag, pulling out a small notebook, the same kind she had carried with her everywhere when she had been that girl. She placed it in the young artist's hands. "Keep drawing. Keep pushing. The world doesn't get to decide your worth. You do." The girl held the notebook like it was something precious. "Thank you." Elena stood, giving one last glance around the streets that had raised her, the place where her story began. She had spent so many years fighting, against doubt, against failure, against the weight of the past. And now, standing here, she finally understood. She had never been running away. She had been running toward this moment all along. As she walked away, her heart steady, her vision clear, she whispered the truth that had carried her through every battle, every triumph, every moment of uncertainty. She had once been that girl, but now she was unstoppable,